Hello, my name is Dr. Dan Wedding, and this is DrWedding VB21, reading data from external files, with an introduction to strings and lists. It is a lot of work to manually enter data every time you run a program. This is not how the real world works. Imagine how hard it would be if every time you wanted to withdraw money from your bank, some intern would enter all of the data associated with your account. The same is true when you write a paper. You do not rewrite the paper each time you want to work on it. Instead, you open an existing file, alter it, and save off the changes. If you've been following these videos in order, you will notice the steps to read in data from a file start out in a similar way as writing data to a file. First, create a stream reader variable. An example is shown below. Second, point the stream reader variable to a file you want to read. An example is shown below. When you read in a line from an external file, it takes in the whole line as a single string variable. The command to read in a line from an external file is shown below. Often, you have no idea how many lines are in an external file. So you need to keep an eye out for a special character that marks the end of the file. The command to look for the end of file marker is shown below. Note, you will need an existing text file so you can practice reading into your project. The easiest way to make this file is with Notepad in Windows. When you save the file in Notepad, put it in a location that is easy to find. I will be putting my files in C:\\mydata. When saving the file in Notepad, do not add a .text to the name. If you do, your file will end up being something like bob.text.text, and VB will not open the file. The example code below will run when button 1 is pressed. This code segment will open an external file, read one line at a time, and append the line to a text box. You may wish to pause the video and review this code. The previous example demonstrates the tools you will need to use to access an external data file. However, the data you are reading in will rarely be a single line of text. Furthermore, the data that gets read in needs to be saved somewhere so it can be used. In order to read in different types of data, you will need to cut up each line and extract the needed information. This is done using lists and string manipulation. A list is a variation on an array. There's a lot to learn about lists, and I could easily do another video on just lists. But for this video, I will cover some of the basics. String manipulation is a term used to describe cutting strings, extracting data, appending data, and so on. There is a lot to learn about string manipulation, and I could easily do another video just on string manipulation. But for this video, I will cover some of the basics. Because we are reading in from the file one line at a time, we will need to save each line in an array so they are not overwritten. This presents a problem. You don't know how many lines are in the file, so you won't know how many array elements you will need. To fix this problem, we will use a list of strings. Think of a list as a magic array that will grow as we give it more information. The command to declare the list named all lines from file is shown below. In the example below, the lines in the external file are read in and saved to the list. Because the number of lines in the file is unknown, a do-until loop is used. The do-until loop stops when it sees the end of file marker. Each time the do-until loop runs, another element is added to the list. You should pause the video and review this code. Once the lines are in the list, there are some interesting tools you can use. As I said earlier, I could do another complete video on lists. One example is you can sort the list alphabetically using the command sort, as shown below. You can also ask the program how many elements were added to the list using the command long count, as shown below. But lists are not as easy to work with as an array. Furthermore, each element in the list holds all the information from a single line from the data file. Each list element still needs to be cut up into usable parts. The data in the list needs to be extracted and saved into arrays. When reading in data from a file, you must know how each line is formatted. This allows you to create the needed arrays to save the data. There will be 3 steps to get the data out of the list and into the correct arrays. First, create arrays that are the correct size. This is done with the redim command. Second, step through the list using a for each loop. Third, parse the data and put it in the correct array. This is done with the indexof, substring, and trim commands. Assume you have a file with 3 pets on each line. You will need to generate 3 arrays. Start by giving each array one element as shown below. Once the file has been read into the list, the array can be redimensioned to match the size of the list. We know the size of the list because of the long count command. The command to redimension the arrays are shown below. In order to move through the list one item at a time, we need to use a new kind of loop called a for each loop. The for each loop automatically starts at the beginning of the list, steps through the list one item at a time, and automatically stops when it gets to the end of the list. Every time the each loop runs, it copies the current list item into a variable so it can be used inside the loop. The for each loop will create the variable for you, and you get to call this variable anything you want. As a convention, many people will make the list name plural and the variable singular, but this is not mandatory. Assume you have a list of strings called many cars. You could step through the list using the for each loop shown below. In this example, the singular variable one car was created by the for each loop. As the loop runs, it copies the first element into one car. When the loop finishes running, the next list element gets copied into one car, and the process continues. An example is shown below. The next for each example is functionally the same as the previous example. It's used to demonstrate that the loop variable can be anything. The variable one car is now blue bullfrog. You need to perform some string manipulation on the list elements to extract the information. Assume the first 3 lines of the file are shown below. Each piece of information is separated by a comma. However, it doesn't matter if the data is separated by a comma, space, asterisk, question mark, or any other character. The procedure is the same. To extract the data from the list, we will use 3 commands: indexof, substring, and trim. Indexof returns the index of any character you ask for. In the example below, the integer int comma is 3. The C is at index 0. The A is at index 1. The T is at index 2. And the comma is at index 3. So int comma is 3. Substrings cut out a piece of the string so it can be copied to a new string. Substring asks for 2 pieces of data: the index of the starting point and how many letters you want to copy. The second parameter of substring is a point of confusion. Most people would assume the second parameter is the index of where you want to stop. That is a very good assumption, but it is incorrect. The second number is how many letters do you want to copy. This is shown below. In our example, the word cat starts at 0 and we need 3 letters. So the command to extract cat is shown below. The command copies 3 letters, the C at 0, the A at 1, and the T at 2. Because VB and most other languages index starting at 0, indexof will load the integer 3 into int comma, meaning the comma is in the 4th position. The index of the comma is also the same as the number of characters before the comma. This is exactly what substring wants. So, the following 2 commands copy everything before the comma, but not the comma, into pet1. Trim is used for cleanup. Sometimes there are random blank spaces in your file. In the example below, there are 2 extra blank spaces after the word cat and before the comma. Assume we use the previous example as shown below. This would cause string pet1 to be equal to the word cat with 2 extra blank spaces at the end of it. Trim simply removes any blank spaces from the beginning and the end of a string. An example of how to use the trim command is shown below. Continuing with the cat, dog, snake example, the cat was extracted from the string, but we need to get the dog. This is done by cutting the cat off the original string and moving dog to the front of the line. To cut the cat off the string, use the substring command again. Start at 1 space after the comma, as shown below. Next, calculate how many letters are left in the string. This is the total length of the string, minus everything before the comma, and minus 1 more to remove the comma. This is equal to the equation below. The command to cut the cat and the comma off the string is shown below. Follow the previous command with a trim, just in case there are random blank spaces. There's a lot to take in here. However, the best way to learn this is through an example. So let's get started. I've opened up a new project named VB21. I've also created a data file using Notepad. The data file is called student_data, and each line has 5 pieces of information on it, separated by a comma. There's a name, a student ID, and 3 grades. This program will open up this data file, read in each line, and separate this line into 5 parts. I could use 5 parallel arrays. However, I'm going to use a class instead. I'm going to use a class because I find it easier to work with, and it will give you an opportunity to review classes. So I'm going to create the class by making sure my project name is selected, go to the project window, and add class. I also could add item and select class. It does essentially the same thing. The name of my class is going to be student. My student class is going to have variables associated with it. The information is going to match the data that's in the data file. This class has a name that's a string to hold the student's name. The ID is an integer to hold the ID number. It has a 3-element array to hold the 3 grades, and a double variable to store the average of the 3 test grades. This value is not in the file, but it will be calculated using the information that's in the file. Let's go back to the form, double-click on the form, and enter the code section. First, we're going to declare the variables. I've created a stream reader variable. Inside of form load, I point this variable to the file I want to read. To be safe, I put this inside of a try catch. Now that the stream reader is configured, we can create a list of strings. This list is called all file data. We can read in a line from the input file and add it to the list. This is done inside of a do until loop. The do until loop is pre-checked. This is to prevent a problem if the file is blank. If the file isn't blank, the loop will continue until the input file reaches the end of file marker. The whole thing is inside of a try catch for safety. At this point, I'm going to add a text box to the form. I'm going to echo this external data file to this text box to verify I'm reading in the information correctly. I've added a few lines of code. First, I cleared the text box for safety, and then used a for each loop. The for each loop will go through all of the elements in the list and move them into the variable text line one at a time. Inside the loop, the variable text line and a new line character are both printed to the text box. Let's run the program and see what happens. The information from the file has been read in and printed to the text box. Currently, this is not all that useful. I have 4 strings, 1 string on each line. This information needs to be cut up and stored in variables. I'm going to store this inside of the class I created. Now that I know that I'm reading in my file correctly, I can delete this test code. Now I can start to write the code that will extract the usable information from the string. I'm going to do that inside the student class using a method. A class method is just a subroutine inside the class. It will do specific jobs using the variables that are in this class. This method is called getData. GetData will be passed one line of text from the program. That line of text will be stored in a variable called line of text. I used by val, so it's going to be a copy and not the original. The public at the beginning of the subroutine lets the form access this subroutine. I'm going to start by creating an integer to hold the location of the comma. The comma is what delineates or separates the individual pieces of information in this string. The first piece of information we're going to pull out is the student's name. The student's name starts at location 0 and goes up to the comma. We get the location of the comma using the indexof command. We use the substring command to get everything from location 0 up to the comma and store it in the variable name. Now that we have the name, we can move on to the ID. To get the ID, we have to remove the name from the front of the string. This is done using the substring command again. The new substring will start at 1 space past the comma, and the total number of characters we want to copy will be the total length minus the characters in front of the comma and removing the comma. Finally, I use the trim command to clear out any stray blank characters. From here, it's surprisingly easy. We just need to repeat this process for the ID and the grades. There is one change though. We need to convert the ID to an integer before we store it in ID, and we have to convert the grades to doubles before we store them into the variable grade. By repeating these 4 lines over and over, we can extract all the data. There are some changes along the way. For example, we have to use cint to convert to an integer, cdbl to convert to a double. And the last piece of data is just directly copied into the variable because there's nothing in front of it and nothing behind it. You may want to pause the video at this point and take a look at the program and read the comments. If you don't want to use a class or you don't want to use a method in a class, this same subroutine could be copied directly into your project and it would work the same way. Let's go back to the code and use this method to extract the data. From before, we know we've read the information in from the data file. Now we're going to extract it using the method we just wrote. First, we're going to create an array of the class student. However, this array will only have one element. Note, there is no new in this declaration. That happens later. First, we have to know how many lines were read in from the external file. This is done with the long count or the count command. Now that we know how many elements we need in all students, we can redimension it. This is done with the redim command. Now we have the entire array of students. We now need to issue the new command to each student. This can be done in a for loop. I'm going to make a little room on the screen by minimizing these 2 try catches. From here, we're going to take the information from the list and load it into the all students array, one element at a time. This is going to be done with a for each loop. We start our counter I at 0. This will be our loop index. The for each loop will step through the list, all file data, one line at a time. It will copy one line into line of text. Line of text will be passed to the class method that will extract the data and populate all students. I is then incremented, so the next time through the for each loop, the next piece of information will be populating the next element of the array, all students. At this point, the array is populated with the information and we can do anything we want with it. As a demonstration, I will print the information neatly to the text box. This section of code is just going to print the information to the screen. You may want to pause the video and look over the comments and the code. Let's run the program and see what happens. All the information has been extracted from the external data file and put into usable variables. From this point, you can do whatever you want with the information. In review, the steps to read in information from an external data file are as follows. First, create a stream reader variable and point it at an external data file as shown below. Second, read the data from the file and store it in a string. This string could be a string variable, string array, or a list of strings. Read the data into the string using a do until loop. Stop the loop using end of stream. If you only need the string, you are done. If you need to extract the data from the string, you will need to do a little more work. You need to create one or more arrays for the data, each with one element. Instead of creating parallel arrays, it is better to create a class variable to hold the data. Assume a person is a class with a string name and an integer ID. After the data is read into the list, the array needs to be redimensioned. This is so the class array has the same number of elements as the list. This can be done using long count or count. Because this is a class, once the class array has been redimensioned, it needs to have the new command issued to each of the class array elements. Finally, pull out the data using a for each loop. The data can be removed using string manipulation. Assume the information in this example is separated by a comma. If you find these videos useful, please like and subscribe. It is the only way I can continue to make these videos.